My mother said it in front of 12 people, like she had been waiting all night for the line. An unfit single mother. The words hung in the suffocating air of the private dining room at our local country club in Lancaster County. I'm Kara, 32 years old and a pediatric nurse. I sat perfectly still, directly across from my parents, my older brother, and his new fiancée. A thick stack of legal papers had just been slammed down in front of me by their lawyer. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed my brother subtly adjusting his phone on the edge of the mahogany table, the camera lens pointed squarely at my face. They were baiting me. They desperately wanted the chaotic reaction, the tears, the screaming, the complete meltdown. I knew immediately that if I gave them even an ounce of that desperation, the recording would be sent straight to my ex-husband within seconds. But I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. Instead, my hand slowly slipped under the table, touching the smooth leather of my handbag. Inside rested a simple navy folder holding bank records totaling exactly $46,280. They sat there with their arrogant smirks, entirely convinced they were about to take my daughter away from me tonight. What they didn't realize was that I had brought the truth, and their entire house of cards was about to burn to the ground. Before we get into my story, let me know what time it is and what city you're watching from so I know how far my story has traveled. If you've ever been the one your family used and still blamed, stay with me. Subscribe if stories like this hit close to home, because this one changed the way I understood family. To understand why I stayed calm at that table, you need to know what my life looked like before anyone called me unfit. My name is Kara Benson, and I am 34 years old. The center of my entire universe is my daughter, Haley, who just turned 7. She is navigating the second grade with a passion for crafting plastic bead bracelets. She loves it. She also insists on plastering colorful stickers all over her lunchbox every morning. We currently rent a small, modest duplex tucked away in a quiet neighborhood of Lancaster County. We certainly aren't wealthy by any means. Our home is impeccably clean, incredibly stable, and runs on a very strict daily routine. My professional life revolves entirely around the graveyard shift as a hospital billing coordinator. While the rest of the world sleeps, I am awake processing complex insurance codes. I spend my nights arranging manageable payment plans and deciphering confusing patient balances. I fix problems. I constantly argue over the phone with stubborn insurance representatives who refuse to cover essential treatments. This tedious job has thoroughly trained me to meticulously keep every single document. I maintain an organized filing system for all medical bills and payment history receipts. I throw nothing away. Living this way requires an extreme level of financial discipline and constant personal sacrifice. I still drive a rusty, decade-old car that makes concerning, loud noises on the interstate highway. Almost all of my everyday clothes are carefully selected from local thrift stores or clearance racks. I am extremely frugal. We exclusively cook our meals at home, and going out for expensive weekend entertainment is practically non-existent. My priorities have always been rigidly straightforward when it comes to raising my daughter alone. Haley will always have warm meals, proper school supplies, and a dependable home. She comes first. Her father, my ex-husband Sean Wallace, is not inherently a malicious or evil person. He simply possesses a profound inability to proactively shoulder any real, heavy adult responsibilities. He shows up for the fun weekend activities, but vanishes when the hard parenting begins. He is absent. His mother, Linda Wallace, is an entirely different and far more exhausting story. She constantly drops thinly veiled hints that my demanding night shifts are harming her granddaughter. She relentlessly questions exactly who is watching Haley during those late hospital hours. She questions everything. She interrogates me about when I actually manage to sleep during the busy week. She often implies that a rented duplex cannot possibly provide enough stability for a growing child. The painful truth is that I have never been genuinely afraid of my parents yelling at me. I have dealt with their severe disapproval and constant criticism for my entire adult life. What truly terrifies me is the dark, looming possibility of a vicious custody battle. I protect Haley. I am deeply afraid they will unfairly weaponize my exhausting hospital work schedule against me. I know they would eagerly use my frugal, single mother lifestyle to brutalize my reputation in court. They could easily manipulate the narrative to forcibly tear my little girl away from my arms. That fear controls me. It was a typically cold, heavily overcast Tuesday morning after a particularly grueling 12-hour night shift. I had just pulled my unreliable car into the cramped parking lot of our small duplex. My physical exhaustion was incredibly heavy, violently pulling at my eyelids as I finally turned off the sputtering engine. I desperately needed rest. Right at that exact moment, my cell phone abruptly shattered the peaceful, quiet morning silence. My mother, Denise, was calling me before the sun had even fully risen in the sky. The first call came right after a night shift, when I was too tired to understand I was being handed a job nobody else wanted. My mother's voice was violently trembling through the phone speaker. She frantically explained that my father, Martin, had suddenly lost his management position. They were terrified. They were already falling desperately behind on their massive monthly mortgage payments. They could not afford their rising utility bills or expensive daily medications. Denise spoke in that deliberately soft, trembling tone she always used. She manipulated me. She knew exactly how to subtly use my extreme exhaustion to make me feel overwhelmingly guilty. She practically begged me for a temporary financial loan to save their home. "Just this once," she whispered desperately. "Don't tell Eric. Your father would be absolutely humiliated." I sent that initial payment without any hesitation. Martin called me briefly a few long hours later. He did not offer any genuine words of gratitude or a simple thank you. He only sternly commanded that we must keep this embarrassing financial situation strictly within the family. He demanded secrecy. Martin has always been a proud man who profoundly loved giving strict orders to everyone. He desperately needed to be constantly viewed as the strong, infallible provider of our household. He stubbornly refused to openly admit that he actually needed his own daughter's financial assistance. He was proud. That frantic promise of just this once quickly morphed into a heavy, continuous monthly obligation. I quietly began transferring money on a highly regular, scheduled basis. I covered the overdue mortgage to prevent the greedy bank from initiating terrible foreclosure proceedings. I handled it. I paid the threatening electric bills to keep their large suburban house properly illuminated. I secretly purchased their vital prescription medications when their medical insurance coverage suddenly lapsed. I paid for an expensive emergency repair when their basement water heater catastrophically failed midwinter. I fixed everything. I silently covered multiple expensive insurance copays for their various unexpected and costly medical appointments. Every single transaction slowly added up over the course of those incredibly grueling, exhausting years. The total financial support eventually accumulated to exactly $46,280. It was staggering. My older brother, Eric, was never once asked to contribute a single dime to their survival. He is a few years older than me and has always been their absolute golden child. My parents constantly praised him loudly to anyone who would willingly listen to them. They adored him. They always proudly referred to him as the incredibly responsible and exceptionally brilliant older son. Eric was always enthusiastically talking about his massive business plans and his incredibly bright future. He was the man with the future, while I was simply the girl fixing the consequences. He dreamed big. However, whenever a real financial crisis actually hit our parents, my phone was the one ringing. This toxic dynamic was deeply rooted in the very foundation of our early childhood. Eric was constantly rewarded simply for having grandiose ideas and speaking with completely unearned confidence. I was quietly handed all the difficult chores because I was deemed the reliable one. I obeyed them. I stayed completely silent throughout all these years because I genuinely believed I was helping them. I foolishly convinced myself that sacrificing my financial stability for my struggling parents was right. However, that deeply ingrained family dynamic was about to shift in a very ugly direction. Everything changed forever. Eric eventually announced his exciting, lavish engagement to his wealthy new fiancée, Marissa. That joyous celebration quickly changed the fundamental rules of our heavily guarded silent family secrets. My long history of quiet financial sacrifice was slowly being twisted into a convenient public lie. Eric's lie did not start as a speech. It started as a sentence nobody corrected. He proudly brought his beautiful new fiancée home to officially meet the family over dinner. Marissa Cole was a genuinely kind, incredibly polite woman who worked at a local credit union. She was innocent. She intimately understood complex loans, detailed credit history, and the severe importance of financial responsibility. She was completely oblivious to our heavily guarded family secrets regarding the massive hidden debt. During the main course, Eric casually leaned back in his chair and smoothly changed the conversation. He lied effortlessly. He confidently announced, "I've been financially helping mom and dad stay on their feet lately." Martin slowly nodded his head in solemn, quiet agreement while sipping his expensive red wine. Denise simply smiled warmly across the table, as if her golden child had just saved them. They supported him. I stood silently near the kitchen counter, deeply paralyzed by the sheer audacity of that fabrication. I instantly realized my 3 agonizing years of sacrifice were being seamlessly stolen to build his resume. Marissa immediately beamed with immense pride, openly praising Eric for being a wonderfully responsible man. I did not object. I aggressively bit my tongue because I absolutely refused to create a chaotic scene in front of a guest. I later learned that Eric was actively preparing to launch his own residential home repair company. He desperately needed to project a flawlessly stable, reliable image to ensure his new business would succeed. He needed trust. Furthermore, he likely needed her professional connections to introduce his business profile to her credit union. He shamelessly used my stolen money to essentially buy her profound respect and financial backing. I remained completely invisible, while my older brother confidently soaked up all the unearned glory. I stayed quiet. Shortly after that infuriating dinner, the tone of my parents' conversations began to subtly shift. Denise suddenly started asking highly unusual, deeply probing questions about my precious daughter's daily routine. She relentlessly interrogated me about exactly who was picking up Haley when I worked the graveyard shift. She was digging. She persistently demanded to know where Haley slept whenever my hospital schedule required a sudden change. She constantly asked if Sean actually knew about my supposedly unstable, chaotic working hours. Martin eventually chimed in, ominously mentioning that Linda Wallace had been expressing some severe doubts recently. He sounded threatening. "Linda has concerns, and maybe she has a point," he stated with a cold, calculating look. I felt a terrifying chill immediately run down my spine as his heavy words lingered. I suddenly realized my parents acutely knew exactly what my most vulnerable weakness truly was. They weaponized Haley. The next evening at the hospital, I finally broke down and confessed everything in the break room. I tearfully told my best friend, Trisha Adams, about Eric casually stealing my financial credit. I nervously explained the terrifyingly specific questions my parents were asking about my custody arrangements. Trisha was furious. She possessed a fiercely protective personality and immediately recognized the dangerous game my parents were playing. She looked me directly in the eyes with absolute, unwavering seriousness across the small table. "Keep records, all of them," she warned me in a dangerously low, commanding voice. I listened carefully. A few tense days later, my cell phone violently buzzed with an incoming call from Denise. She enthusiastically invited me to a family dinner at the country club to celebrate Eric. Denise invited me to Willow Creek in the voice she used when the favor was already decided before she asked. She smoothly explained that they were hosting a crucial family investor dinner specifically for Eric. Marissa was obviously going to be there alongside several other wealthy relatives. They needed me. My mother firmly insisted that our entire family needed to look perfectly united for this very important evening. I immediately found the extremely formal invitation incredibly suspicious. My parents almost never invited me to exclusive, expensive places like that. They ignored me. Whenever there was a public event meant to make the family look successful, Eric was always the undisputed center of attention. I was normally excluded entirely from their glamorous celebrations. I suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of impending dread. I was scared. The bizarre warnings began arriving through my phone shortly after that initial phone call. Martin sent me a demanding private text message containing extremely specific instructions for the evening. He coldly wrote, "Dress appropriately. Don't bring tension. This is important for your brother." I read carefully. Eric quickly followed up with his own incredibly brief, arrogant message just an hour later. He simply typed, "Just don't make this weird." I felt a deep, sickening knot rapidly forming in my stomach as I read their coordinated messages. I suspected everything. I instantly knew they were meticulously setting up some kind of terrible trap for me. I needed backup. My best friend, Tricia, immediately offered to safely babysit Haley for the entire night. Once my precious daughter was comfortably asleep, I sat down and finally opened my laptop. I logged directly into my secure banking portal and began downloading 3 years of my extensive transaction history. I worked quickly. I carefully printed every single record of the massive payments I had dutifully sent to Martin and Denise. I meticulously printed the official mortgage receipts alongside all the desperate emails where Denise had begged me for cash. I also printed the demanding text screenshots from Martin insisting on absolute secrecy regarding their ruined finances. I documented everything. While searching through my chaotic email inbox, I suddenly remembered a massive business packet I had received recently. Marissa had accidentally copied me on a chain of incredibly detailed business loan documents a few weeks ago. I slowly scrolled through Eric's official residential home repair company prospectus and felt my blood boil. I was furious. Inside the glossy pages, Eric shamelessly described himself as the sole financial savior who had supported his parents. It was the undeniable written proof that he was actively using my silent sacrifices to fraudulently build his image. He maliciously stole my exhausting life to secure his shiny new business loan from her credit union. He stole everything. I neatly stacked the undeniable bank records, the official mortgage receipts, the desperate emails, the text screenshots, and Eric's loan statement. I deliberately placed all of these explosive documents into a sleek, simple navy folder. I honestly did not pack it with any malicious desire for dramatic revenge against my toxic family. I was prepared. I simply refused to walk blindly into their carefully orchestrated trap, completely empty-handed and defenseless. I nervously drove across town and eventually arrived at the grand entrance of the Willow Creek Country Club. I immediately spotted my parents' familiar sedan, parked neatly next to Eric's newly leased luxury SUV. I needed armor. I walked slowly toward the private dining room, feeling the heavy weight of the navy folder against my side. I paused for a brief second and looked quietly through the heavy, ornate glass doors. I could clearly see Eric placing his phone face up directly on the edge of the mahogany table. It was beginning. Willow Creek looked calm from the parking lot, but the room they gave us felt arranged before I ever walked in. I slowly pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped into the impeccably decorated private dining area. The luxurious space featured pristine white tablecloths, crystal glasses filled with ice water, and elegant printed menus. I was outnumbered. The atmosphere was terrifyingly quiet, carrying an artificial politeness that immediately put my nerves on high alert. My father, Martin, and my mother, Denise, sat rigidly at the head of the long mahogany table. My older brother, Eric, was seated comfortably next to his incredibly sweet, entirely oblivious fiancée, Marissa. They were waiting. My quiet Aunt Joanne was also present alongside a few other distant relatives and wealthy business acquaintances. Marissa immediately stood up and greeted me with a genuinely warm, incredibly polite smile across the room. Eric did not even bother to stand, simply offering a dismissive, arrogant nod in my general direction. As I carefully pulled out my designated chair, I noticed his expensive smartphone sitting near his water glass. He was recording. He had intentionally placed it at a very specific angle so the camera lens pointed directly at me. The expensive dinner initially began with several rounds of agonizingly fake, perfectly rehearsed casual family conversation. Eric enthusiastically talked about the upcoming launch of his brand new residential home repair company. Martin proudly praised his son, while Denise cheerfully lectured everyone about the importance of family unity. I stayed silent. Martin reached into his suit jacket and slowly placed a legally drafted document in front of me. The bold black letters at the top ominously read, Family Stability Agreement, in a sterile font. He smoothly explained that the entire family simply wanted to generously help me with raising Haley. He cleared his throat. He suggested I should acknowledge that I was currently experiencing severe personal stress and financial difficulties. He claimed my loving parents were offering to temporarily take over primary caregiving duties for me. I read the document carefully until I found the incredibly dangerous clause buried near the bottom. It was a trap. The paper demanded I formally acknowledge that my grueling night shift schedule negatively affected my parenting ability. I instantly understood that this signed confession would be sent directly to Sean and his mother Linda. I looked up slowly and quietly asked Martin what would happen if I simply refused to sign it. They were ruthless. Martin coldly replied that they would be forced to take severe legal action to properly protect Haley. Denise leaned forward slowly, her cold eyes entirely devoid of any maternal warmth or genuine human sympathy. She looked at me in front of 12 people, like she had been waiting all night for the line. I did not flinch. You are an unfit single mother, Kara, she stated flatly. Haley deserves stability. Eric immediately glanced down at his recording phone, eagerly anticipating my inevitable emotional collapse on hidden camera. Denise coldly continued, threatening that if I did not cooperate immediately, they would personally testify for Sean. I was surrounded. Linda Wallace already had significant concerns, and my own parents were now willingly offering to validate them. Aunt Joanne looked visibly tense and incredibly uncomfortable, yet she remained cowardly silent in her expensive chair. Marissa's cheerful smile completely vanished as she slowly began to realize this dinner was a vicious ambush. They wanted tears. I could feel the suffocating weight of the entire table heavily pressing down on my exhausted shoulders. They desperately wanted me to hysterically scream, violently cry, and completely lose my temper for Eric's camera. I did not touch the silver pen lying menacingly next to their fraudulent, insulting legal contract. I stayed completely calm. Instead, I calmly reached into my leather bag and slowly pulled out the thick, heavy navy folder. I placed it firmly on the center of the mahogany table for everyone in the room to see. I looked directly into my mother's shocked eyes without breaking my intense, unwavering gaze for a second. It was my turn. I didn't touch the pen. I simply ignored their fraudulent contract and calmly opened my Navy folder. I looked directly at my deeply arrogant brother and my intensely manipulative parents without any fear. You brought a statement, I said quietly to Eric. I brought records. They were stunned. I pulled out the very first page and deliberately placed it face up on the polished mahogany table. It was a comprehensive summary of my personal bank records spanning 3 incredibly exhausting, difficult years. The detailed document clearly highlighted every single massive transaction successfully transferred directly to Martin and Denise. They were exposed. The highlighted grand total boldly read exactly $46,280. I did not frantically throw the papers, and I certainly did not loudly yell at anyone. I stayed calm. I simply continued placing each heavily documented page down on the table with deliberate, rhythmic precision. The next page revealed the official suburban mortgage receipts, clearly bearing my personal account name everywhere. Then came the desperately emotional emails, where Denise had relentlessly begged me for immediate emergency cash. I proved everything. One specific printed email had a bright yellow highlighted line that clearly read, "Please don't tell Eric." The following page displayed the text message screenshots from Martin fiercely demanding absolute financial secrecy. The very last explosive document I placed on the table was Eric's residential home repair loan packet. I was silent. I pointed directly to the glossy page where Eric proudly claimed he had successfully supported his parents. Marissa immediately frowned, aggressively pulling the entire stack of printed papers directly toward her side. Because she actively worked at a local credit union, she possessed the professional ability to read fast. She understood immediately. She instantly understood the devastating severity of the massive financial fraud lying right in front of her. She knew perfectly well that if Eric lied about his financial support, his professional reliability was broken. She slowly looked up from the undeniable bank statements and stared directly into Eric's panicking eyes. Numbers never lie. "How much did you actually pay?" she asked him in a dangerously low, chillingly steady voice. Eric immediately began frantically stumbling over his words, desperately trying to quickly avoid her direct question. He loudly accused me of completely overreacting and viciously choosing this specific dinner to ruin him. He was panicking. Marissa firmly ignored his pathetic, defensive rambling and sharply asked the exact same financial question again. Eric sat there in complete, humiliating silence because he could not truthfully produce a single dollar. Martin angrily attempted to quickly intervene, loudly declaring that this was strictly a private family matter. I stopped him. I looked directly at my furious father with absolute, unwavering disgust burning deeply in my eyes. "You made it a custody matter the second you threatened my daughter," I replied coldly. Denise suddenly buried her face in her hands and began loudly sobbing to manipulate the room. I felt nothing. Suddenly, quiet Aunt Joanne finally spoke up from the far end of the long table. She confirmed she had personally witnessed Denise crying in the kitchen when begging me for money. She firmly stated that both Martin and Denise always knew perfectly well I was paying everything. The truth hurt. The entire private dining room instantly plunged into a suffocating, incredibly heavy and uncomfortable silence. Marissa abruptly stood up from her chair, grabbing her purse with shaky, furious hands. She coldly announced she would not professionally support his fraudulent business loan package anymore. She was done. She firmly stated she would absolutely never sign any legally binding financial papers with a liar. She sternly told Eric they desperately needed to seriously reevaluate their entire upcoming wedding engagement immediately. Eric frantically reached forward and finally turned off his recording smartphone, but his pathetic gesture was late. He lost everything. I calmly gathered my original documents, deliberately leaving the stack of undeniable copies scattered across the table. I quietly walked out of the luxurious room before they could ever falsely paint me as hysterical. I finally walked out into the cool evening air, leaving their entire shattered world behind me. I was free. By the next morning, they were not asking whether I was okay. They were asking what I planned to do with the proof. I refused to post anything on social media or loudly start a public family war. Instead, I calmly called a highly respected family lawyer named Ellen Grant for professional guidance. She took control. She instructed me to securely save all my bank records, desperate emails, texts, and their fraudulent agreement. Ellen immediately sent a formal cease and desist letter directly to Martin, Denise, and Eric. The letter firmly mandated that they must never contact Sean or Linda with fabricated information. I was protected. It legally prohibited them from ever visiting my house or approaching my daughter Haley anywhere. All future communication was permanently restricted to go exclusively through my attorney's formal office. I logged into my bank portal and completely canceled every single recurring monthly financial transfer. I stopped everything. I sent one final emotionless text message to the family group chat before permanently blocking their numbers. I firmly wrote that there would be absolutely no direct contact and no visits to Haley's school. I sternly commanded them to never call my ex-husband Sean with any more vicious lies. I was done. There was no more stolen money, and there was absolutely no more access to my precious daughter. The harsh reality of their terrible decisions quickly began to completely dismantle their comfortable lives. Marissa immediately withdrew all her professional support for Eric's fraudulent residential home repair loan package. She left him. The credit union predictably refused to proceed with his business application without her financial backing. His business plans were completely halted, and Marissa indefinitely postponed their lavish upcoming wedding engagement. Eric lost his beautiful future because he foolishly chose to build it on my sacrifices. He failed completely. Meanwhile, Martin and Denise were forced to frantically call their mortgage servicer to beg for a hardship payment plan. They had to seriously consider selling their luxury vehicles and downsizing their massive suburban house. Their carefully crafted public image of a wealthy family, supported by their golden son, was shattered. They were broke. Aunt Joanne eventually mailed me a deeply emotional letter, apologizing for remaining cowardly silent during that terrible dinner. I quietly read her heartfelt words, but I absolutely refused to use her apology to reconnect with my family. My attorney preemptively contacted Sean, firmly ensuring he would not be easily manipulated by my parents' future lies. I was safe. Linda Wallace no longer possessed a convenient, one-sided story to unfairly weaponize against my demanding hospital schedule. I took the exact monthly amount I used to send my parents and opened a secure savings account for Haley. I chose absolute, permanent no contact with the deeply toxic people who selfishly raised me. I chose peace. Boundaries do not maliciously break loving families apart or suddenly destroy genuine, healthy human relationships. They simply stop selfish people from comfortably using your quiet silence as the sturdy foundation for their massive lies. Thank you so much for carefully listening to my incredibly difficult personal journey with my toxic family. I survived it. Please let me know your honest thoughts and personal feelings in the comments section directly below.